questions in the chat, and we'll keep those things, those questions with us, and Scott will answer them after the session is over.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so let's get started here. So what I'd like to do is just work through some. We'll just work through some ideas coming from the Agile modeling method. So I think what I'll do is I'll first start with an overview of the history. And so Agile modeling came about in the early 2000s, and it was actually first based on, so I led the development of it. I'm certainly not the only one that worked on it. And so in 2000, I wrote an article for a software development magazine, which no longer exists. But anyway, so in software development, I wrote an article focusing on how do you do modeling and documentation on an extreme programming team. And this basically was just this practical, keep it lightweight type of an approach. And it really took off. So, I think the second or third day after it was published, Kent Beck sent me an email and said, "Oh, this is awesome. This is exactly what I've been trying to describe for a while." We actually had a conference, the first extreme programming conference in 2000. One of the big topics at that conference was how do you do modeling documentation, and they sort of struggled. They never really got it. And so anyway, so I'd written this article and really got a lot of interest. And people got behind it, and they said, "Hey, you know what? Let's figure this out." So a bunch of us got together at various conferences. It took us about a year, but we got together at various conferences and online, and there's discussion forums and all that sort of stuff. And we fleshed out what this extreme modeling thing was all about. So then about 6 months into the effort, Bob Martin got involved, and one of his very first points was, well, wait a minute, there's more here than just extreme programming. How do you do modeling and documentation on extreme programming? So what you need to do is either cut it down to be just for XP, or keep it as it is and rename it to that way the name matches what the scope was. So we renamed it, and then he suggested, so why don't you call it Agile Modeling? Because this, a bunch of us just got together to go skiing. We came up with this Agile idea. So I said, okay, why not? Yeah. So we renamed it to Agile Modeling, and that name has stuck ever since. So then in 2002, the first Agile Modeling book came out. It was published by John Wiley Publications, or whatever they're actually called. But and the book came out, was a very good seller for them, and it's been going ever since. So, and there's a website, agilemodeling.com, and so we've been sharing a lot of information there. So anyway, so just to put all that in perspective, so since then I've gone beyond Agile modeling, and I developed the Agile Data method, which extended Agile into in the database space. And then in the last 7 or 8 years, we're working on the Disciplined Agile framework, and which Agile modeling and Agile Data and Scrum, XP, and Kanban, and many other things are all a part of. So, but anyway, so the focus here, though, for the most part, is going to be on Agile modeling. So let's get into it. So, anyways, the point here is, so I want to basically cover 2 topics. So the first one is how can an Agile team benefit from modeling and also address modeling? And one thing I should also mention is that documentation is unfortunately highly coupled into modeling. So when we first started developing this method, we really did honestly we desperately tried to focus just on modeling, but the documentation stuff, we just couldn't tease out documentation by itself. So having said that, my focus is on modeling here. I will talk about documentation a bit. And I also want to distinguish between modeling and documentation. So modeling is the effort of thinking things through, and modeling and planning are very similar things actually, but modeling is the effort of thinking things through and discussing it, maybe sketching it, and then documentation might be a side product of that. Many of you can model on a daily basis actually, and yet never produce any documents describing it. You draw a sketch on the wall or put some stickies on the wall, and then and that's a form of modeling. But then you never really take it the next step further, which is to capture it. Like either something as simple as taking a digital snapshot of a whiteboard, that's an active documentation, let alone if you type it into Word or some fancy documentation tool. So anyway, so we need to distinguish between modeling and documentation. And this is important because, to be quite blunt, the developer community and certainly the Agile community has just gotten themselves wrapped around an axle when it comes to modeling and documentation. It's really problematic because modeling is a swear word for many people. I've been on teams where they'll tell you, to swear up and down, we're not doing any modeling, and meanwhile, they'll be sitting in front of their whiteboard which has diagrams all over it. And I've been in conversations, in these delusional conversations, but I've been in conversations where I say, well, wait a minute, what the heck is that right there on the whiteboard? So, well, that's our sketch of our architecture. Dude, that's a model. Like, come on. Oh, no, it's not a model. It's a sketch. Oh, come on. Forget, So we've really, so we really talk, because modeling and documentation tend to be swear words, particularly for Agilists, we've really sort of messed ourselves up on terminology. So for example, the Scrum guys are desperate not to talk about modeling. They talk about backlog refinement or backlog grooming. That's modeling, or modeling and planning, because there's really two activities going on here. But that's an act of modeling, but they've messed up the terminology because they desperately don't want to use the word modeling. And that's a serious problem. And this is one of the reasons earlier, before we started, we were talking about, well, some of us haven't heard, some people had heard about Agile modeling. Well, yeah, because now, we've got an entire generation of people who have lost the terminology of, basic fundamental stuff, and they don't even think to look to Google anymore. So anyways, there's a lot of material out there about modeling that would help you if you're to only, learn how to use this. You learn how to use a search engine. So anyway, and we'll talk a little bit about how modeling can benefit from Agile as well. There's to be fair, there's a little bit of dysfunction in the for the small number of people who are still actively modeling. There's a little bit of dysfunction there. Okay, so moving on. Okay, so some basic fundamental concepts straight out of Agile modeling. So one of them is stakeholders should be active participants in modeling. And this was actually based on the extreme programming practice of on-site customer. If you remember that all, the basic idea was that developers and customers, the business folks, should work side by side, and the developer should ask them questions. And in Agile, and which is great, and that's actually one of the principles in behind that manifesto. But one of the you can actually take that a little bit further, is our point, and say, so wait a minute, and our basic observation is, well, wait a minute, these people are smart people, so instead of just having them sit there and ask some questions, why don't you say, hey, here's a marker. Why don't you go up to the whiteboard and walk us through what you actually want? So you can put your stakeholders, your customers, to work and get them to do the modeling. Because frankly, the people who are best suited to particularly do business-oriented modeling, are business people, not technical people, not business analysts, not product owners, but actual business people who do the work day in, day out. That's the people I want to have thinking and telling us about the business, not some in between. And it's interesting. So one of the concepts in Disciplined Agile, in the Disciplined Agile framework, is that context counts, and that choice. And another one is choice is good. So in what we like to do is we don't prescribe anything. So in some methods, it'll say, well, this is the only, this is the official way, this is the official Scrum way of doing things, or this is the official safe way of doing things. And that's nice, but in Disciplined Agile, we don't do that. We think that's arrogant. We don't think that's very good advice in most cases. But instead, what we do is to say, well, you need to think things, you need to address certain issues, and you've got choices. So for example, you need to address the issue of how we're going to get requirements out of our customers, out of our stakeholders. How are we going to understand and explore these requirements? And there's different ways we can do that. We could just do nothing, make stuff up. That's, a lot of developers love doing that. We could have a business analyst, and we could have the business analyst can go off and talk to the customers and have conversations and model and do whatever business analysts do, write up a document and throw it back at us. We could have a product owner, which is better than making crap up. So that's a good thing. We can have a product owner who actively works with the customers and actively works with the team and acts as a go-between and all this stuff, just like they say in Scrum. That's generally better than having a business analyst. Or we could do better yet, and we could just actively work with our stakeholders and have get rid of the go-between and actually work side by side collaboratively, sort of like they implied in the Agile Manifesto. So this is what we've been talking about in Agile modeling for over 15 years now. These more advanced, more effective techniques than, say, what some of the mainstream Agilists would want to do. Of course, it requires skill. You've got to have analysis skills, you got to have some people skills, but you can get those. You can pair with each other and get them, or you can do mob modeling, or whatever you want to call it these days. But you can certainly do that. So anyway, so working side by side with your stakeholders and putting the work in and be actively involved is probably a pretty good thing, as long as you're using inclusive tools. So this is another thing we talked about in Agile modeling years ago, was using very simple tools like whiteboards and Post-it notes and paper and stuff like that. Because back in the day, everybody thought, well, modeling, well, you've got to have a big fancy case tool for that. Again, go off and buy, Rational Software Architect, or Telelogic Software Architect, whatever it's called in the day, and have these fancy tools and UML and all these very difficult to understand notations. And many professional modelers still do that, and they wonder why they get ignored. Well, I've written books on UML, several books that sold phenomenally well. And frankly, I struggle to read some UML diagrams these days because the notation has gotten so complex. So, and I actually was the first published author about the UML outside of the OMG. First author about the UML, and I struggle these days to understand some of these notations. So if I'm struggling with it, I got to think almost everybody else is too. So anyways, we can do better. So we should prefer direct collaboration over documentation. This, I think, is a fundamental of collaboration. We've known for decades now that documentation is actually a rather poor way to communicate information, and that face-to-face conversations around some sort of a shared sketching environment is significantly better. So let's do that. Now, we still might need some documentation, don't get me wrong, but using documentation to communicate information from one person or a group of people to another group of people is the worst, or it's the least effective means of doing that. It's the riskiest and most expensive way of communicating. So if you like throwing money away and you like having a lot of errors, then writing up detailed specifications is definitely the way to go. If you don't like doing stuff like that, if you actually want to understand what people want and do that, then you need to work you need to work closely with each other and communicate better. So anyway, so my friends in the modeling community could probably take that to heart, or not, depends. So an interesting question that we tried to answer years ago, which we still don't have data for, by the way, so I'll rant about that in a second. But an interesting question that I think people should ask is, what is the value of modeling? Or what is the value of planning? So, I'll put it on the managers among us. What is the value of planning? How do you judge? And this is an important question people answer, because a model or a plan or any sort of artifact should be just barely good enough for the situation that we find ourselves in. And unfortunately, that varies. It varies on several things. So, it varies on the complexity of the problem you're addressing. It varies on the skills of the people involved, the knowledge and experience of the people involved. So, if you've got a very complex problem, you probably have to do more modeling and more planning than for a very simple problem. If you have very expert people involved, you have to probably do less modeling and planning if you have a bunch of novices involved, and then combinations thereof, of course. So what's the point of this diagram? So in the traditional world, particularly in the modeling and planning world, they tend to assume that doing a lot of modeling adds a lot of value, and then just keep doing more modeling, and let's just keep throwing more bureaucracy at the problem, and things will get better, right? We want to have a detailed upfront requirements document. We want to do detailed upfront data modeling or detailed upfront scheduling. So let's think everything through. The problem with that is there is exactly zero evidence supporting that. Zero evidence. There is nothing. Unfortunately, there's also zero evidence for the Agile approach as well, which is based on anecdotal evidence. So the anecdotal evidence shows that the value of modeling actually follows the law of diminishing returns. And that's what this chart is showing. And so the point is that modeling and planning, you get a lot of value very quickly out of doing just a little bit of modeling and a little bit of planning. And you do a little bit more, and you'll get more value. But then suddenly you start to lose value because you overthink things, you overmodel, you might even overdocument. And it's actually possible for your modeling and planning efforts to have negative value. So you put more money, more time into it than you save getting rid of the risks on whatever it is that you're doing. So there's a very fine balancing act. And the reason why it's a fine balancing act is because it depends. like I was saying about earlier. So why is there no evidence for this? Well, this is a brutally hard thing to research. To be fair to the researchers, this is virtually impossible to get hard data on, because you've got to actually work with a large number of teams in a lot of different situations over time, and you've got you've got to go out and feel. It's not something you can experiment with on students. It's not something that you can just luckily run some complicated simulation of and get some. You've actually got to go into the field, observe teams in practice, do ethnographic research for years, and you got to work in companies where they'll actually let you go in and gather data, which is not a lot. So this is a brutal thing to research. Actually, a couple of years ago now, a gentleman got a PhD in describing how to do this, how to do the research. He didn't do the research. He just figured out how to do the research and got a PhD for that. That's how complicated this stuff is. So anyways, I highly suspect that any time in my lifetime, and I plan on living a long time, we will not ever get data on this issue. But the anecdotal evidence is there. You can choose to observe this if you want. So anyways, so when people ask you, how do you know when something is good enough? The answer is it depends, but it depends on this. Now, an interesting implication of this graph is that if you want to be conservative when you are modeling and planning, you should under-model and you should under-plan. So, which is not something you're going to think, tends to freak people out. But the idea is that if I haven't modeled enough or haven't planned enough, then I can go back and put more effort into it. But as soon as I go over the top of that curve and I'm on the, on the downward slope, all I can do, all I'm going to do is add more cost. I might be able to increase the value, but I'm still going to add more cost and more time. So because I've already over-modeled, and now I got to continue to over-model in order to figure out whatever it is that we're trying to think through. So I want to under-model, which then blows the minds of the professional modelers. So, and this is something you've really got to work them through. So anyways, you want to do just enough modeling. Just enough is in the eye of the beholder. It will vary by team. So if your organization is looking for one defined way of determining how much is good enough, or the one official template to fill out, good luck with that. That is delusional, will not work unless all your teams are the same people in the same situation every single time. I have never actually seen that in practice. And I get to go to hundreds of organizations around the world. So model should be just barely good enough, exactly as we apply, exactly as that previous diagram implied. Keep them barely good enough for the situation at hand, and frankly, under model. So here's something that some of the Agile might freak out Agilists. You want to do some upfront modeling. You want to do some upfront requirements modeling. Those requirements have got to come from somewhere. Everybody talks about, in Scrum we talk about having this product backlog, this stack of user stories, or stack of small chunks. Actually, doesn't have to be user stories, but where do those requirements come? Where do those stories come from? Do they just magically appear one day? The team forms on Monday morning, and the very first day of your project, or very first day of the team, and suddenly, from the Starship Enterprise, suddenly a stack of index cards beams down with user stories on them. This must be what happens. No, we all know that's total crap. That somebody has to identify these initial requirements. So my point is, well, let's do this in a streamlined manner. Let's be really smart about this. We want to do just enough modeling up front to get a handle on what the scope is going to be. Because in the vast majority of situations, and I've got solid data on this, by the way, and roughly, over 90% of all Agile teams at the beginning of a project, or whenever it is that they're starting, they're asked basic questions like, what are you going to do? How long is it going to take? And how much is it going to cost? And how are you going to do it? And if you can't answer those questions, you don't get funding. This is the way the world actually works. And in order to answer some of those questions, you got to have a handle on the scope, which means you got to do some initial requirements modeling. My advice would be to do this as collaboratively and as streamlined and as lightweight as possible. Just do enough to, just do barely enough to get by. So anyways, there's different ways that we can do upfront modeling. One of the challenges that I've noticed over the years, and it's getting worse, is that we've really narrowed our focus in the Agile community. Like it's overly prescriptive. It's disgusting. We've got, everybody's talking about user stories, and as if that's the only type of requirement you could possibly do. I was working with an organization a couple of weeks ago, and the team was just like floundering. And the reason why is, they had thought, and their coaches had told them, well, the only thing we can do is write user stories. And they were getting killed on non-functional requirements. And so, I said, I'm working this team. I said, well, what happened here? I said, well, where are your security requirements? Where are your requirements for performance and availability and all these other important things as well? They're not really captured in our user stories, and we try to capture them as tests. And I said, well, okay, that's sort of cute, but look at all these stories you get. Like you got hundreds of stories here. You're telling me you're able to capture all your security requirements across every single story? You must be from the planet Krypton. I can't even imagine doing that. I just can't. And he said, well, no, yeah, sure enough, it didn't work out, and I had some severe security challenges. And I said, come on, guys, let's go off and let's do some security, do a little bit of security modeling for a couple hours, think through what you need to actually build, and then start building it, right? Oh, no, we're doing Scrum. I couldn't possibly do any thinking. Come on. So anyways, yeah, you gotta have multiple models, multiple views. So if security is an important thing for you, you should probably think through security is the point. Security is not an important thing for you, you don't need to invest any time in it, right? So just do good enough and do enough to get the job done. So the best architectures and designs emerge over time. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this from the Agile Manifesto, but that doesn't mean to be stupid. Right? You need to start with something. You need to, yes, the best designs and architecture are going to emerge over time, but, you should maybe do a little bit of upfront thinking, get going in the right direction. So spend a couple hours or spend a day or two doing some upfront architecture modeling and think it through. Identify basic things like, what legacy environment are we working in? What can we reuse? What constrains us? Because every team is constrained. You've always got architectural constraints. There'll be certain technologies you're allowed to use. There'll be certain technologies in place that you darn well better use or have a very good story for why you're not using them. And there's things in your organization you probably desperately want to avoid. So if you're in an Oracle shop, yes, it'd be great if you can go off and play with SQL Server or one of the NoSQL databases. But if that's not really on the architectural roadmap, then you probably shouldn't be playing with it, or at least you should have a very good story for why you need to be using Hive or what other database technology makes sense to you. So we should do a little bit of modeling up front, think things through, and get going. And also, more importantly, if there are technical risks, and there always will be, so for example, maybe you are using Hive for the very first time, great. Then let's think this through. Let's identify this and identify that as a risk, that something maybe we should spike this and play with it for a while and figure out what the heck is going on. So, or maybe you're using two technologies that you're familiar with, but you've never used them before together in the same environment, or maybe there's new versions or something, right? So you identify your technical risks and then nail them with spikes or prove them with working code. There's other techniques, but do a little bit of thinking first and get going in the right direction. You can dramatically improve your chance of success. I run into so many Agile teams where they don't do this upfront thinking, and then they got big amount of rework 5 or 6 sprints in because they didn't think things through. And it's like 2 hours of thinking would have avoided 4 or 5 sprints of fooling around now. So just do a little bit of thinking up front. Okay, so having said that, we want to think about the future, but you can wait to act. So a really good book, I guess about 15 years ago now, written by Josh Krivsky, the guy behind Modern Agile, was called Refactoring the Patterns. And one of the basic principles or implications of that book is that, yes, you should identify where you want to go in your design or in your architecture, but you don't need to code it on day one. You can say, hey, we're sort of going in that direction, and we're sort of going to the singleton pattern. Maybe we're going to some other complicated pattern. Nothing's coming to mind, but we're going over that. We think we need to apply that pattern. So instead of spending a couple days or a few weeks banging out the code to implement that pattern, why don't we just say, hey, that's the direction we're going to go in. So when we need to write our code that sort of starts to flesh that out, what we'll do is we'll write our code in such a way that when it makes sense to implement that pattern, when we're 89% of the way there, then it's like, hey, yeah, that pattern's a great idea. We can do that. And if we never end up implementing code that actually needed that pattern, well, then, no harm, no foul. So this is the exact same thing in Agile modeling. What we want to do is think, what direction should we be going in? And then we start going in that direction. But if it ends up that we steer away from it for whatever good reasons, because we learn and we experiment as we go, that's great. But if it ends up that, oh yeah, we were 99% correct on pretty much on day one, then we've we've avoided a lot of fooling around. And to be quite blunt, the vast majority of things that we build in this in the IT space are blatantly obvious. Like, I work in banks and insurance companies and in retailers and in e-commerce firms, and I'm telling you now, most of the stuff we build, you could think through up front, at least at a high level, get going in the right direction on day one, and you can avoid a lot of waste by just having the humility to do a little bit of thinking up front. So think about the future, but wait to act on it. It really does depend. This is something that we've really sort of fleshed out in the Disciplined Agile space, because when you're building a doghouse, you might do a little bit of modeling to build a dog. I've never built a doghouse, but I assume you're going to do a little bit of sketching to figure out how big this doghouse is going to be, but nowhere near as much as if you're building a house or building a skyscraper, right? So the amount of modeling that you need to do depends on your situation. Also depends on the people. So you need to tailor your approach. One size does not fit all. One model does not fit all. A very huge challenge in the modeling community is you get too many overly specialized modelers. You got somebody who's phenomenally good at data modeling, but don't know how to do something as simple as a user story. Or you got people that are just focused right now on user stories and a couple of associated techniques, and they couldn't do data modeling to save their lives. And meanwhile, they're off building databases that are going to be around for 20 or 30 years, and they don't even know the basics of normalization. Worse yet, they don't even know that the database already exists. It's on another server somewhere, and they didn't need to create it at all because they didn't do any upfront architecture modeling. But anyways, that's another detail. The larger the team, the more you're going to have to do, more initial modeling you're going to have to do. The more complex the problem, the more initial modeling you're going to have to do. The more complex the technology, more need for a little bit of architecture modeling. The greater the need compliance, well, that's going to force you into documentation mode. Sorry. I work in regulatory environments. Roughly over half of Agile teams are now in regulatory situations. So I think we need to start, doing a little more, having a little more coherent conversations about the needs for being regulatory compliant. At the same time, for the auditors among us, we need to loosen up. Read the regulations. So if you are in a regulatory environment, read the regulations. Do not let the bureaucrats interpret the regulations for you. When you do that, you will end up with very bureaucratic interpretations of those regulations, and you get what you deserve. So stop complaining about how tough you've got it because you're in a regulatory environment. Step up and read the regulations because they're nowhere near as bad as you've been told. But if you don't read the regulations, you'll never actually discover that. I've worked in financial regulatory situations, life-critical regulatory situations, death-critical regulatory situations, and it's nowhere near as bad as the bureaucrats will tell you. But read the regulations, which is phenomenally boring. To be fair, the regulations are just a snore fest, but read them. It behooves you to do that. Have practical people interpret the regulations, and you'll get a significantly better interpretation of them. One of the things in Agile modeling, and we made one of the principles was to have multiple views. Basically, go at the same problem from multiple directions. So this I think is a serious challenge with some of the one-hit wonders that we have in the modeling community. When all you can do is data modeling, you're going to do an awesome job at data modeling, but you're going to miss some very important things. Like you won't be doing any UX modeling, you won't be doing any usage modeling or security modeling, and you'll miss some very important features. And same thing, I would say the exact same thing of people in the UX community. They might do some really great UI stuff, but some of the things they build are just horrendously bad, or at least that they design are horrendously bad because they didn't think through usage. They didn't think through the data aspects. So we really do need to go at it from multiple views, which is why we're modeling with others. So one of the practices of Agile modeling is to model with others, to do pair modeling or do mob modeling, I guess you could call it now, and then have multiple heads are better than one, basically. So this is the classic, when three blind men fondle an elephant, they each think they're fondling something different. None of them figure out that they're actually dealing with an elephant. And this, I think, is the challenge we have with professional modelers is, they're all fondling one aspect of the system, but they're really never getting to the heart of what it is that our stakeholders actually want. Change is good. Embrace change in requirements. This is a fundamental of the Agile space. This is still rocket science for a lot of professional modelers. I'm working with one organization right now, and this it's like I'm insulting their babies, telling them their babies are ugly by saying, hey, it's okay to have changing requirements. We had some very interesting conversations last week about the reality of changing requirements and how it's actually happening regardless of their change prevention processes that they have in place right now. So anyways, so it's truly embrace this, but at the same time be smart about it. Go at it from go at requirements from multiple views, and make people aware of the cost of changing requirements. Don't allow people to be flaky, or at least motivate them not to be flaky by sharing real costs and the implications of these changes. We want to do, this is straight out of Lean. What's interesting, we at the time, we didn't really have much of a focus on Lean when we first started identifying all these practices and principles of Agile modeling, because we were just observing what was happening in the real world. So, going back to the history for a second, several hundred people, easily several hundred people had input into this methodology. It was quite extensive. We had purposeful workshops at several conferences where people flew in to specifically work on this. So it was an interesting process to. I was the leader to lead, and it was all pretty good. So anyway, so one of the things that we talked about pretty darn early was to leave to do just-in-time modeling, leave the details to when you need to gather the details. So defer commitment from a lean point of view. And next thing, just defer commitment to make better decisions. This can be a huge issue when you're bringing Agile to existing modelers or to existing traditional planners. And the idea here, when you're landing a plane, so if a human's actually landing a plane, most jetliners are landed by computer now, but if the humans actually have their hands on the stick, then they're adjusting as they go. They're not just like pointing down and holding on for the best. They're actually adjusting and making last minute pilot decisions second by second in order to land the plane safely. So you don't want to be planning 10 miles out and then walk away from the stick and just let the hope for the best. And of course, travel light. This is straight out of extreme programming. You want to have lightweight artifacts. Keep your documentation, keep your models as lightweight as you possibly can. We reuse, we stole or reuse whatever spin you want to put on that as much as we possibly could. And extreme programming really sort of nailed that concept. So, anyways, credit where credit's due. So my parting advice before I go to questions, keep modeling and documentation as pragmatic as you possibly can. I suspect I haven't said anything here that you didn't already know, but I also suspect I said a few things that you had to learn the hard way, and that maybe weren't so clear when you first started getting into Agile. So like I was saying earlier, it probably behooves you to learn some of the older terminology, not this not all the buzzwordy stuff that the Agiles like to fly around. And that I think is a serious challenge in the Agile community. We reinvent names for everything. So a lot of last few years people have been talking about road mapping. That's a model. Roadmap is a model. But yes, so because modeling is a swear word, well, we can't use that. So yet we inherently know we need to do some modeling. So what do we call it? Well, we call it road mapping now because we all follow roadmaps. Models, that's evil, but road mapping now, that's good. Come on, marketing buzz. But what can you do? So this modeling, this road mapping stuff, planning stuff, whatever you want to call that, really is critical to your success. But stay focused on the value. We talked with the value curve. It really, I would be 99.9% sure that it follows the law of diminishing returns. If there's just overwhelming anecdotal evidence of that being true, which really sort of depresses the traditional modelers, but because that's not what they want to hear. But it really does seem to be the case. So a little bit of modeling goes a long way. A lot of modeling puts you into trouble. So tailor your modeling strategy to meet the situation that you find yourself in. Different teams, even different teams in the same organization, will have different levels of modeling, different levels of planning, different levels of documentation, because they're different people in different situations. It is what it is. So if you're looking for one standard way of doing things, you are barking up the wrong tree, and you will fail miserably. I can guarantee that. And that's probably not what the bureaucrats among us want to hear, but it is observably true. A few slides ago, we were talking about different situations. A team of 5 people will take a different approach to modeling, documentation, and planning than a team of 50 people. Teams in regulatory environments will do the same compared to non-regulatory environments, and so on. So we really need to be smart about this, and that means we need to be flexible, and it means we need to know what we're doing. So anyway, so thank you very much. There's some, I'll take questions now. I'll just leave this slide up. There's some several great resources out there. Obviously, the Agile Modeling site, but there's some good stuff at the Agile Data site too, around data modeling for the most part, but and a lot of other good stuff, not modeling related at all. And then, of course, at the disciplinedagedelivery.com site, there's a lot of the latest thinking on how this all fits in. So the Disciplined Agile framework really sort of puts us all together, with modeling documentation being a very small part of the overall picture, but an important part of the overall picture. Just like Scrum is a small part, and Kanban ideas are a small part, and extreme programming ideas are a small part, and so on, and they add up to a Disciplined Agile approach. So anyways, let's take some questions.
There is. There's a question from the chat which says, how can a component team apply domain modeling technique to gather requirements? Do you have any insights on things that they could use?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a challenge. So it's the issue here is that requirements tend to cross components for the most part. Now there'll be some, it depends. Well, first of all, it depends on how you've organized your components. Are these domain components that we're talking about, or technical components? And it doesn't matter either way, but that is a factor. If it's domain components, then it's probably a little easier to slice and dice your requirements to match to a domain component as opposed to a technical component like a security framework. Having said that, non-technical requirements will apply very quickly to technical components generally, as opposed to functional requirements, which tend to hit multiple technical components. So the point is that you'll need to know, so whoever's writing the requirements up or identifying requirements or gathering or eliciting requirements will need to understand what the architecture is, this component vision that you've got, and then be able to organize the requirements and sort of map them into the component architecture. So now a lot of people will start freaking out. Well, feature teams are the only way to go, right? It's just naive rhetoric around that in the industry. And so the point I want to make there is that when you have a very good architecture, like a highly cohesive, loosely coupled architecture, suddenly component team, a component-based approach, component team type approach is viable. If that's not the case, and in very few situations that you actually have a decent architecture, because you're almost always dealing with legacy. So when the architecture is a bit of a mess, component teams will almost always fail miserably. And I think this is why we see such bias against component teams. It's not because it's fair bias, because very few people can actually tell me why they don't like component teams, other than, well, everybody likes feature teams. That's the entire level of that logic. So generally people do feature teams because it tends to be easier to do. But anyways, we've got a solid architecture, component teams are viable. Otherwise, I'd probably stay away from them.
That's a really great insight. Thank you. So another question was, what happens in the absence of any modeling and when product development is driven by user stories only?
Yeah, so that tends to blow up in people's faces, and they often don't know why. And the reason why is user stories, and there's nothing wrong with user stories. They're a great, small, and when I say user stories, I also mean, there's epics involved too, right? So all the entire user story ecosystem, what you want to call it, it might be user story maps. But the challenge with user stories is that they are very good at doing usage modeling, understanding how people are going to use this thing, this system, the solution that you're building in order to fulfill, whatever dreams they've got. So, which is great. But they're completely useless at data modeling, and data is usually an important aspect of what you're building. They're completely useless at security. They're completely useless at architecture design modeling. So they have almost nothing to say about user interface, for example, right? So you would do prototypes or wireframes or whatever in order to explore the user interface. So user stories are very good at one thing, and wireframes are very good at another thing. Data models are very good at another thing. So you really do need to have multiple models or multiple viewpoints, which can be explored however you want, because the thing that you're building has multiple aspects to it, which should probably be thought through. So yeah, so if you're just doing user stories, it's probably a problem. But you know what? I've seen a lot of teams where they say, oh yeah, we're all user story driven, and then behind the scenes, people are doing other things. They're just not talking about it. So I think we, particularly in the IT industry, but yes, certainly Agilists, have a very good capacity for ignoring what they don't want to see and not talking about the things that aren't sexy and the things they're not allowed to talk about. So these people are telling you that they're just doing user stories. I bet you that's not actually the case. I bet you they've done a couple screen sketches in behind the scenes and then erased it or something. But
cool, thanks. So we do have another question. The question was, can we turn it around perhaps? Are you trying to call everything else modeling? So if architecture is modeling, information radiation is modeling, planning is modeling, what's not modeling?
Yeah, well, very good question. So I don't think I said that information radiators are models. Many models are things that get radiated. Radiation or information radiation was one of the principles behind Agile modeling originally. But anyways, be that as it may. The fact is, what I'm talking about is that thinking things through. Modeling is all about thinking things through and communicating and collaborating. Planning also happens to be the same. I distinguish between the two. Maybe I shouldn't, but I do. But there is a very good argument that planning and modeling are two aspects of the same thing, because you're basically thinking through the future, what your vision of the future is. And then you could say that a plan is just one type of model, whatever. But if you agree or disagree with that, I don't really care either way, but I'm just saying that's an issue. So, but the point is that, you can and should do architecture modeling, right? Because you would model to think through your architecture. You would model to think through your requirements. You would model to think through your plan. That's the base of the level, or model to think through your design. A test, actually TDD is a form of modeling, a very low level form of modeling. But this is actually one of the things we worked through years ago in Agile modeling. How does modeling and testing fit together? Or does test-driven development fit together, I should say. And if you're smart, you use models to think through the big issues, and you use tests to specify in detail. And that requires discipline and skill, but that's the basic idea there. So use sketches and post-it notes, and maybe get really complicated, use Visio or something to think through the big ideas, but then use tests to think through the minute details.
Great, thanks. So I had a question. I think someone else had a question, sort of a similar one. It was, number one, the first question was, what does just-in-time planning mean? And I think my corollary to that question was really, is there a way that you have found to know what does it really mean to do just the right amount? So we don't want to overdo, we don't want to underdo, but, and I know it depends, right? But have you found a way of determining what's that sweet spot? So explain just in time for the person whose question, and then, how can we determine what the right amount of just in time is, if possible?
Yeah, so the answer is it depends. There is no better answer than that. I appreciate that's not what you want to hear, because that's a frustrating answer. But the next level down would be you need to have people with good judgment and experience on your team. So because it does depend, right? You get a good sense of, I think we've done enough. Who go on? We actually used to have, and we still do have, advice for getting out of analysis paralysis mode. So how do you detect that you're just spinning your wheels and doing too much modeling, or doing work and not actually getting anything done? But for the most part, that's a judgment thing. It's like, somebody's got to say, wait a minute, we're wasting our time here. Let's forget this, move on, let's do something else. It was basically the entire advice. And you think you wouldn't need to say that, but you do, and you really do. But so it depends. Like I said, it depends on the complexity of what you're dealing with, and that will vary by team. It depends on the skills of the people that are doing the modeling. If you happen to be handing information off to people, which is not a good idea, but if that's your situation, it depends on their skills and ability and how much time they'll have to spin up on that. What's interesting though is this is less than, like, everybody freaks out about this, right? Everybody's worried. How do you detect if it's good enough? I'm not even sure that passes the who cares test. If I have a team that's reasonably collocated, at least collaborating very well, then if we under-model, which is always my advice, then it doesn't matter, because as soon as you realize, oh, we didn't think that through, woe was me, not such a big deal. I say, hey, hey, do you have a second? Can you come to the whiteboard and think this out, right? And then we talk about it, and oh yeah, that might work. And we go back to our desks and we build whatever it is we just talked about. But if it's hard to get hold of people, if we're not collaborating well, if they're on the other side of the planet, or I'm not allowed to talk to them because of corporate politics or whatever, then suddenly it's a painful thing when I discover we have a modeler planned enough. So let's solve the real problem. Let's be as collaborative as possible. Let's get our stakeholders actively involved, and then suddenly these sorts of concerns just disappear. They really do.
So Scott, one question I have on that is, when we talk about data modeling, then XP says that you take a story and then you start implementing the data model, whatever you want. So that comes as part of the implementation of the user story. So I mean, I'm just trying to understand, when you say that data modeling may be having a focused area to think about, apart from the user story, what you are trying to say on that.
If we're going on mute. So there's a couple issues here. So, well, once again, it depends on your situation, right? So if you're working on an analytics project, for example, where maybe it's a big data thing, and you're getting data from all over the place, and you're trying to figure out what it is that you've got, you can spend weeks and sometimes months. I've worked in an organization where they have a very coherent story and a need to do data modeling, like data analysis at least, for several weeks at least, in order to figure what the heck do we have here, just before they actually get into any sort of implementation of using that data in a meaningful way. The data is also a shared resource across teams, so it's a complete fantasy that these user stories actually cover enough information from a data point of view in most cases, because that's a user story for a specific situation, but the data is a shared resource that's being used for hundreds or thousands or maybe millions of different reasons. So the thing is that what are the semantics? What are the business rules here that aren't covered at all by this user story? And these could be like legal requirements from years and sometimes even decades ago that the stakeholder that you worked with to identify this user story is completely oblivious to, and might not even care about, and yet still, that legal requirement is there and that need is there. So I think we need, and this once again gets to the challenge of user stories. I love don't get me wrong, I love user stories, but I also understand their limits, and they are very limited on purpose. On purpose, that is a very simple technique that is limited on purpose. So once we go beyond the limits of user stories, you're in serious trouble. And I think, and the data is a classic example of this orthogonal issue that crosses many, many, many stories, hundreds or thousands of stories in some cases. And if you're just focused on one story, you will do a bad job from a data. You could do a bad job on other things too, but you'll certainly get in trouble in the data. So you're effectively injecting technical debt when you do that. Probably not a good thing. So my advice would be, well, let's just be humble enough to realize that, hey, let's have multiple viewpoints, and let's explore, do enough data modeling to get the job done. Let's have people on our team that understands these data things. So that's basically it.
Makes sense. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. So another question came in about help selling the just-in-time modeling and ideas to management who wants the more defined scope in order to fund a project. So any assistance or tips there?
Yeah. So first of all, I don't think I've ever worked for an organization. Well, actually, I've worked for one or two where that was not an issue. Yeah. So you need to help. You need to work through. Yeah. So when my company helps organizations with agile transformations, we engage at the executive level specifically for reasons just like that. The executives need to be up to speed on this, and same thing with middle management as well. So you need to help them get some basic education in Agile to help them rethink things, and then you need to work through like for that specific issue. And I would say, and there's could have been a dozen other questions you could have asked that senior management would also struggle with, and my answer is always the same. You need to help them understand the issue, but more importantly, very first thing out of my mouth when I get that from an executive is really how well is that working for you right now? Because I know it's not. And when they're asking for a big detailed spec up front and this big fantasy plan up front, I know that is failing miserably. I don't have to know anything about the person. I don't have to know anything about the situation. I know for a fact that is failing miserably. And I also know if they're asking about that, they're delusional and that they are fundamentally unable to observe that it's failing miserably. So first thing I do is help them understand that it's failing miserably. And so I, get them to, tell me stories. Tell me what the XYZ team, how their detailed modeling go. Oh well, those bastards, blah blah blah. And they start telling you the horror story of why they crashed and burned. And he says, oh well, what about this other team over there? How are they doing? Well, those bastards, blah blah blah. And it's like, okay, and then it very quickly gets to the point. Do you have any good stories for when this worked out well? And if they do, then I know they're lying, because then I say, really, because in order to come in on time and on budget, did you drop scope? Really? Oh, you did, didn't you? So you weren't on time and on budget because you had to drop 2/3 of the scope. So come on, right? So these are these are uncomfortable questions for everybody involved, but you got to have them. It's easier for me because I'm coming in from an outsider, and I'm also happy to be fired. But a little harder if you work there. If you think you're gonna, if you're afraid to be fired, then it's a much harder discussion to have. But you got to have it. Otherwise, they will continue to make bad decisions. And this is actually something. One thing I'll do a blatant plug. We just recently published the book, An Executive Guide to Disciplined Agile, and it's written for executives to walk them through the fundamentals of Agile and how it's going to affect their entire organization, such as how does it affect finance, how does it affect procurement and HR and all these other good things that are important, that are way beyond software development, that will affect you dramatically if you don't get your act together on those things. So I think the executives need help, and it's not just, we're going to have a big daily meeting, and or we'll have a scrum with scrums, and or you can attend any scrum meeting you want, and that's how you keep an eye on all your projects. What a load of crap that is! Please, please, some of the advice that the Agiles give is just completely naive. So we need to help. We need to help the executives, and we need to answer these questions intelligently. And another part of the answer too is, hey, let's run an experiment and see what happens. And experiment can be a swear word for a lot of management. So that's something I will not give up on. But it's like, okay, you got 150 teams running right now. Let's try this. Let's try this lightweight documentation and modeling stuff on one team and see what happens. Because chances are, right now it's not working out so well for you anyway. So going at risk and doing it in a lightweight manner on one team is probably not going to be, can't get much worse. So let's give it a try and see what happens. And then make sure you work with that team and help them be successful, of course. But keep it light.
Thanks. So I just have, we'll take one more question because we just have a few minutes left. And someone had a question on how would you change this approach working with external clients and trying to get them to work Agile. Her comment is, normally we need to scope up front to know what to charge them, and they need to forecast a budget. So how would you change your approach?
Yeah, so I work with companies like this all the time. First thing I point out, that is a choice that they're making. That's not a very good choice, but it's a very common choice, so to be fair. But yeah, they do not have to do big detailed upfront modeling and planning in order to outsource things. They're choosing to do that. They do need to do some lightweight stuff. So once again, the first question out of my mouth is really, how well is that working for you? Because I know it's not working well. And if they're outsourcing and still doing this waterfall outsourcing stuff, I know for a fact that is not working well. They are probably completely and utterly delusional on their total cost of ownership on that approach. And so I want to work through what's actually happening. on that and help them observe that that is going very poorly for them, and then work through better options and say, hey, let's run an experiment, see what happens. But there's some huge implications there. The procurement people need to know, this is why, once again, executive guide to Disciplined Agile, but the procurement people have got to understand how to procure an Agile team. Because you have to have a contract that says, hey, the guys that are being outsourced to, they need to work in an Agile manner, which they can often do if they're allowed, if they're allowed to put together an Agile team. The customer needs to be prepared to govern and manage in an Agile manner. They need to understand the implications of this, and they probably need to put people in airplanes when they're geographically distributed in order to deal with some of those risks too. So it really does take, it requires the customer organization to be competent at doing software development, which may or may not be the case, which might be one of the reasons why they're outsourcing, is they inherently know they're not very good at software development. So if you're not good at software development, chances are you don't have the skills to govern and manage it when it's outsourced, because that's harder to do than when they're just down the hall from you. But that's a piece of logic that never really got picked up on. So work through it.
Yeah, I had another guy that we had on a webinar series that said, some clients are not right for you, and it's up to you as a business. It's a business decision to say no if the customer is, insisting on the sort of contract. So take on the customers that that your company feels, comfortable with, and tell them that you're working in this Agile manner, and that's what it means for them. At the end of the day, I guess that was the input there too. Yeah,
bad business is bad business.
Yeah. So, all right. Thank you so much for coming today. It's been great. We had about 77 people as a high, and I think this is our highest number to date that I know of. So awesome! It was so informative.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate you taking time out of your busy day. I know there's a lot of people dialing in from India, so it's late at night for you. So thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you, everybody, for taking time with us. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.